Our next speaker is Mark Steyvers. He's at the University of California, Irvine, and he's going to talk to us about modeling large-scale cognitive training data through a partnership with Lumosity.
All right, well, it's great to be here. I've enjoyed the interaction with many of you. Just setting you want to change?
I'm just getting that out of the way.
So we're interested in learning through a data set from Lumosity. Lumosity is a cognitive training platform. Users come there to train in a number of cognitive tasks. These tasks are gamified to keep users engaged. And there are over 50 games in areas like memory, attention, flexibility, problem solving, etc. So here's an example game. This is based on a classic laboratory paradigm called flanker task, but it's gamified to make this interesting for users. So we have to decide the direction of the center bird, ignoring the direction of the flanking birds. Here's a working memory task. It's a two-back working memory task. You have to decide if the card currently shown on the right matches the card shown two cards before it. But there are also other games that don't map onto any known or existing sort of laboratory paradigm. I love this game. It's Train of Thought. It combines multiple object tracking and planning. You have to send trains of a certain color to stations of the matching color. And your goal is to throw the switches in time to make sure this happens. And it gets complicated if there's a lot of switches and there's a lot of trains to keep track of. And you get the feeling if you play this multiple times, you're improving. You're definitely learning something. So after a lot of begging and pleading with Lumosity, we finally got some data from them. I'll focus mostly on what we did with the first data set listed here. We have close to 200,000 users. We know some basic demographics. And the tough part was for Lumosity to pull the raw data, where we know the individual sort of decisions at each individual trial. They saved that data on their warehouse and took the data scientists a long time to pull this data. And that allowed us to do a whole bunch of interesting projects. So I'll talk about three of them. The first one is relating learning trajectories to dropouts. And is there sort of any difference between people who drop out early versus late? People who would have different sort of participation strategies. Then I'll talk about some cognitive modeling projects, and I'll finish up with some analysis, some early analysis of transfer. There's always the question, does training on these games actually make you better in anything else? So first, one of the complex aspects of this data set is that users have a lot of control over their experience. Right? The goal of this platform is to engage users, keep them around. So users are given control in terms of what games to play, when they practice, how long they practice, and when they can terminate. So this is not something we would do in a lab setting, right? We would put people on the same sort of practice schedule and ensure that, or hopefully, people don't drop out during the experiment. But now we have this sort of naturally occurring data, and now we have to account for all these different choices that people make. So here are some learning curves of 6 different users. So they're improving on some score. This is the number of correct decisions made in one gameplay. Each gameplay lasts 60 seconds. So you can see that people are learning, they're improving. The red dot shows you the point at which they stopped. The question is there any relationship between the point at which they stopped and their learning itself? So we've looked at this in a number of ways. One through standard survival analysis. You can relate dropout to the type of game. Some games are just more engaging than others, and some users are more engaged than others. So here are 3 three games: Lost Immigration, Ebb and Flow, and Memory Match. And the survival curves show the proportion of people that are still playing the game after X gameplay, right? So this goes down over time. And there's some game like Memory Match, it's not very engaging for whatever reason. It's kind of interesting because it's the major paradigm used in experimental psychology to study cognitive training. So maybe we should, use this data as a way to, think about, is this what users really want to play? You can also see the differences in colors. Those are the age groups. The yellow colors are the older demographic, all the way up to 70 to 80 years. You can see that these older users are more engaged. They drop out less. Right? They maybe have more time. They're more invested in this kind of platform. You can also look at dropout as a function of aspects of the learning curve. So here's one user sort of going along and improving over time. And then we were interested, can we predict sort of their dropout as a function of some aspect of their improvement over time? So maybe the fact that this user, their performance was deteriorating at the end, maybe that's predictive of dropout. And it turns out it is. If you look at the angle of that learning slope, the conditional probability that somebody's playing the last game is much higher if their learning if their performance is tanking. So it's one of many signals you can use to predict dropout. So in the end, what we find is that there's a relationship between people who drop out early versus late and their learning trajectory. So here we aggregate across people who practice, let's say, at least 100 game plays. Those are shown in red, versus people who play sort of a moderate amount. They drop out after 30 to 50 game plays. Those are the learning curves shown in blue. And what's interesting is that especially for the older users, shown here on the right, there's a difference. They are in different learning trajectories. So we have to be very careful not to aggregate across too many different users. And keep this into account, that dropout might be an explanatory variable. So we're trying to build various cognitive models that jointly account for learning and dropout. And these models are they're tricky. We have to make some decisions on what exactly is the nature of dropout. And this relates to models. So Todd was already mentioning sort of missing data models and statistics. You can make a missing at random assumption. So you could start with a model that says, well, there's some latent learning parameters that explain performance over time. And then you could say, well, dropout is maybe based on the observed performance. Maybe people are monitoring their performance over time and performance is tanking, then they're a lot more likely to drop out. So these models are simple because the dropout decision is conditioned on observed data. That makes this a missing and random model. These models are easy to sort of train, estimate, because the top half of the model can be estimated separately from the bottom half of the model. So this model is okay, but it's probably not quite right. Maybe the truth is something more like a missing, not at random model. Here, your learning and your dropouts might be governed by sort of shared latent parameters. Maybe there's some inherent relationship between sort of motivation, learning. There's some complex sort of causal connections between various latent parameters that jointly explain performance and dropout. So we're in the process of trying to disentangle all these factors. And several of you mentioned this before, that it's nice to have all this large-scale data and this naturally occurring data, but occasionally we need to go back to the lab and do some experiments to tease apart, especially some of these tricky causal assumptions. That you can't sort of do these experiments on this Lumosity platform, right? They don't want to ruin the user experience. On Zooniverse, you can also not manipulate user experience too much, right? So you need to go back to the lab and do these experiments. All right, now I'll move to some cognitive modeling projects of one particular cognitive task. This is the ebb and flow task. It's a task switching game. It's not as fun as the social version that was mentioned yesterday. So this is task switching. You have to decide if the leaves are orange, which way they're moving. If the leaves are green, which way they're pointing. And the color is the task hue, and there's also a label at the bottom. So now, right now, which way they're pointing, which way they're moving. You move back and forth. It's unpredictable when you change from one task to another task. You get some random number of trials on moving, you move to pointing, you move back to the other task. So here's data from 10,000 users. What we're measuring here is the response time as a function of the number of trials after a switch. The first trial in a new block of trials, like you just did some moving trials, now you go to pointing. That first pointing trial is confusing because you had no way to predict that was coming up, and you have to make a response quickly. And so response times are much higher on that first trial in the block. And then people speed up as they go and sort of warm up to this new task queue. The results are separated here by different age groups, right? So younger people, unsurprisingly, are much faster than older people. This is a very speeded kind of task. So with cognitive slowing, it's not surprising that the older people are doing somewhat worse in terms of response time. And you can see as a function of practice, those are the different colors. Everybody improves over time, but also the shape of these curves is changing in qualitative ways. So people are switching between tasks more rapidly. It's only that first trial that's confusing, and after that, they basically switched. So to account for this data, I will just sketch the ideas of the cognitive model here. We assume that there is a latent variable called task activation. This is your ability to retrieve the correct rule from memory and instantiate maybe some attentional filters to focus on the correct sort of perceptual information. You have a task activation for the pointing task and one for the moving task. Well, when the task queue is pointing, then you slowly start to activate that task activation for the relevant task. But this takes some time. So we assume that there's some dynamics in terms of how you can alternate between these two tasks. And we have parameters that govern sort of the changes over time and how much you activate the correct task, how much you're suppressing the incorrect task. And those parameters are all estimated at the individual user level. So then practice in this model could maybe affect your ability to activate the correct task. Maybe practice could activate, or by practice, you might be suppressing the incorrect task more strongly, or maybe you might be more quickly in terms of switching task activation. Those are things we can estimate with the model. So here's a sort of a cartoon version of what we do. We have this task activation for the pointing and moving task, and they're changing over time as a function of trials, but also as a function of session. We have some perceptual encoding model, some binary features for up, down, left, right, separately for the pointing dimension and for the moving dimension. We assume, just like in connections models of cognitive control, that your task activation is modulating your perceptual input, you're gating the perceptual input. So maybe if you strongly activate pointing, most of the pointing information is coming through, but maybe there's some leakage of the incorrect sort of task, the moving, let's say, dimension. Then we sum up these activations across dimensions, and these form the drift rates for evidence accumulator models. Right? So our data consists of response times and accuracy, and the standard way to account for response times is using a set of evidence accumulator models. The idea is that you have a separate race going on for each of the 4 responses, up, down, left, right. Evidence is accumulating noisily towards some boundary, and the boundary is a parameter. And the accumulator that first wins the race determines the response time, as well as the response itself. So this is a fairly complex model with a lot of parameters. There's a lot of correlated parameters. And estimating this model has been, well, a challenge. especially when you do this on a large scale. So we made some simplifying assumptions. Instead of doing the typical hierarchical Bayesian modeling, where you say each user comes from some distribution, we say let's drop that. Each user has its own set of parameters, and that allows us to use naive parallelization. So we can send each user to a separate node on some cluster. I was very excited. I'm using MATLAB a lot, and MATLAB just press a button and then the computation is offloaded to Amazon Web Services. And this is amazing. Instead of waiting 3 weeks, I was waiting a couple of hours. And then the bills started to come in because I had no idea how expensive this was, and I didn't care. There was no grant that was supporting this. This came from my personal account. And there was $100 here, $100 there, and it ended up costing a lot of money. And that's the interesting sort of question, conundrum that comes up. How much is it worth to you to scale up your research? So far, it's worth a lot. So here's some estimates of the model for 3 different age groups. The top lines show you the increases in task activation for the queued task. The dashed lines here show you how quickly users are suppressing the activation for the incorrect task. And you can see age differences. You can also see practice effects. So practice mostly has the effect of increasing the activation for the queue task, and not so much in terms of suppression. Even users that play over 10,000 games, they still cannot sort of get rid of this interference from the irrelevant task. Something that wasn't quite obvious from this plot, there's certain speed with which these curves are growing. And what we find is that the task activations, they change more quickly as a function of practice. So you're more quickly sort of activating the correct task for the queued task and more quickly deactivating the one for the unqueued task. And you get sort of these changes over the first 1,000 gameplays, and after that you have some diminishing returns. It doesn't seem to matter after 1,000 gameplays in terms of this measure. There are other, let me skip this one. So after I played one of these games with my dad, who's obviously a bit older than me, and I was thinking, before I knew much about Lumosity, I can beat him on this sort of friendly competition because this is one of these games that is very speeded, and of course I can outperform him. And it has ended up very embarrassing for me because he crushed me convincingly. And it turned out he was training for over a year in one of his tasks. And so we all know all these cognitive slowing effects, all these sort of the effects on average, but there's also a huge range, dynamic range in terms of practice effects. So what we're looking at is these sort of comparisons between random users from an older demographic against randomly sampled users from a younger demographic, and see who sort of outperforms the other. So brown colors is where you have a higher probability of the older demographic beating the younger demographic. The dashed line is the point of sort of equivalence. And you can see the older demographic has to practice a bit more to catch up to the level of performance of the younger demographic. Not surprising. If we now make this comparison more extreme, on the left side, we're comparing the 70 to 80-year-olds against 20 to 30-year-olds. So in some sense, the people who are sort of peaking according to various metrics. And there's different ways to interpret this. The positive message here is that the older demographic can catch up to a younger demographic, like the 20 to 30-year-olds, if they're relatively untrained. So if all the users trained for, let's say, 60 plus sessions, they reach sort of a performance that's equivalent to, a younger person training only for 5 to 10 sessions. And the fact that this is possible at all is kind of interesting. These effects were sort of hidden in various sort of small-scale data sets. That's only this large-scale data set that allowed us to, discover these kinds of findings. All right, I'll say in a few minutes what we're doing in terms of transfer. Lumosity, as some of you might know, got in some legal trouble. Lumosity, the marketing people at Lumosity made some ridiculous claims that training on these games makes you smarter, whatever that means, and staves off cognitive decline. This is not based in science. This was just, without any sort of empirical backup. And there's an ongoing debate about how much these games transfer to real-world situations. There's also an ongoing debate about proper methodology. How do you assess transfer exactly? And there's some very strong opinions either way. And I'd like to note that most studies are very small scale. The typical lab study has some pre-test, followed by training on some, let's say, cognitive game, followed by post-test. And then you compare the performance against, people who didn't train or people who were actively involved in something, but they weren't training in that particular task. And this paradigm has obvious benefits, but it limits you in terms of how many sort of transfer effects you can investigate. What we're doing is we drop this notion of distinguishing between training and testing. We look at the sequential sort of history of people practicing on Lumosity. So one person might be practicing task A a bunch of times and then start task B. Another person might do a bunch of B tasks and then transfer to A. And then we see, is the first time that you practice B at all related to your performance on the previous task A? Now, this sounds like a good idea, but it's very messy if you look at the variation in practice schedules. Here's one user who practices a whole bunch of games, right, shown in separate rows. This is over a 4-year period. Each mark is an individual's practice event. And honestly, we don't know yet if we have enough natural variation to try out these learning models that are sensitive to the history of gameplay. There's certain sort of natural experiments that happen on the platform. Raindrops is one of these math training games. At some point, that version was dropped and a new version was introduced. So any model that that learns about transfer should probably learn that this raindrops should transfer very well to raindrops too. Right? It's one of the tests for a transfer model. And the hope is that we can estimate the full transfer matrix of every game to every other game on Lumosity, understand the generalization gradient, as opposed to saying there's far transfer or there's not far transfer. All right, so I'll finish up here. Some of the data I've been pushing for Lumosity to make available, and they're becoming more open to this idea. Some restricted data from ebb and flow is now available on Open Science. And we're hoping to, maybe in the next couple of months, to release a much bigger data set that could be of interest to the community. 36,000 users playing many different games, so 51 games. So this is a very rich, multivariate data set. I think would be interesting. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Can you tell us about some of the demographics that are in the data, like whether they're bilingual or other information about the
We only know age, gender, country of origin. And the language that they speak, but I think that was, user volunteered. We don't know about bilingual. I think they only had one option to give in terms of language. Yeah. There's always a question: are bilinguals sort of better in terms of working memory? And yeah, could be very interesting. I don't know if there's additional demographic data that Lumosity has but hasn't given it to us. Yeah.
I was just wondering about what you just said. In fact, what are Lumosity's incentives for giving this to you? And like, presumably they have a ton more information they're not giving you, right? Like, I just assume they have to, don't they?
So one incentive, I think, is they had a bad reputation, right? Because of this lawsuit, right? And they lost credibility with a lot of people, a lot of my colleagues, right? And that led to a backlash, some very negative papers about, Lumosity's claims are ridiculous, and so maybe by working with a person like me who, didn't know anything about transfer, they thought, okay, maybe we can do a little bit better. They have additional data that we hope to get. For example, they have a whole cognitive battery of tests sort of related to sort of IQ measures, and users can volunteer to do those tests. And internal studies at Lumosity seem to indicate that there's transfer to those kinds of tests, but I haven't verified it. This is one of these claims. Who knows? Yeah.
Not so much about what you're doing potentially in the future, but does Lumosity claim to be interested in providing information back to the participants? I mean, there's some cost to signing up for Lumosity, right? I assume there's a subscription cost or something like that, right?
Yeah, there's a free account that limits you in terms of the number of games you can play, and then there's a paid model, right? And they are interested in giving more information back to the users. Yeah. So some of this recent paper that we published that was posted on their blog, right? And users, especially the long-term users, are very interested in reading about those. Yeah.
I don't know about the placebo effect, because once people have been told that Lumosity is a brain training thing, and there's sort of an expectation that it comes from. So things like where, for instance, you really believe that's true, then you sort of somehow derive more benefit from the brain training, or from the exercises, than someone who's sort of skeptical about that claim. If you believe I'm definitely going to improve, and you do the task, you sort of show the improvement. And where if you're somehow skeptical or blind to that condition, then you don't.
Yeah, and in some papers, the argument is let's get rid of that effect, right? Let's do some active control. People who also believe in this activity, and then the more active controls you do, the smaller the whatever transfer effect there was. At some point, it's no longer there. Poof. But the other question is, I think that's interesting, right? That there is this belief, and that belief can actually work. I think we need to do many more sort of lab studies. But we can't do this with this sort of pre-existing data. So I think it would be very nice to push some of our cog-sci work more into these domains of motivation, right? These things that we typically we find a little fuzzy and hard to understand.
Okay, let's thank Mark.
That concludes the morning section of today. We will proceed with lunch from 12:30. It's now until 1:45.
Do we know what rooms we're going to do the tutorials in? Because we're doing Ben's in here, I think, for sure, right? The one that's being live streamed.
Yeah, I had told him to go. I had assigned him to room 802.
Oh.
But I can change that. It's just the link that's different, so it doesn't matter.
So let's go ahead and assign the other two tutorials to largest rooms.
Yeah.
No,
I updated it.
Oh.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have one that's for me and I?
The only one that's assigned right now.
Okay.
Yeah, we can look together.
What?
As long as we figure it out.
Well, I think we need to know we can just do a show of hands. Okay, quick show of hands, just a straw poll. People planning on attending Alex's tutorial on operationalization, revisited finding and defining research questions in today's data sandbox.
And ethics.
Yeah, it'll be a new kind of discussion as well about what ethics mean in terms of all the stakeholders. There are a lot of people who are doing interesting stuff like companies or individual stuff, and so talking about data ethics at this level of ethics is what we'll be part of.
Let's just get pitches for all three, and then we'll get together. Okay, great. I'll be giving the hands-on version of the talk that I just gave, where I'll introduce actual tools that you could use to do adaptive and optical experiment design, and we'll have some discussions about how you might or might not apply those techniques in large-scale experiments that you're thinking or have been running.
And then the third one is
identical to each other, so that's going to be like most kinds of things that you might do, and gives you much more precise estimates of individual variation in ability than you get by just looking at accuracy.
Great, and the point of this is just to gauge group size. Alex's. Thank you. Mine. Ben's. 3 equal roots. Great.
Okay.
And here. Oh, we'll just make the.
Alex.
Okay. If you're attending Alex's, it's in 411. If you're attending Ben's, it's in A02. If you're attending mine, it's in A30. Thank you, and I'll see you all again at 1:45.